Hello, friends. This is Rick O'Hare on behalf of Embrace Tutoring and Educational Services. Uh, Welcome. I wanted to thank everybody for watching, wherever you are, and whenever you're seeing this. I sincerely hope that you and your family and your colleagues are staying safe and healthy and hopeful these days and always. It's probably safe to say that if you've joined us for this presentation, you're one of about 20 million or so parents in the US who are considering multiple school options for their child. That's about 36% of all the parents of school-age kids in the US. And so I hope that this will give you some helpful insights and guidelines as you undertake this process. We're going to try to make you a little bit better equipped than the person showing on the slide. And let's get started. First, kind of on a personal note, in the case of our own children, choosing the right school was a relatively easy process, and at least prior to college. And that's because thanks to tuition discounts for employees, my kids all attended the school where their dad was working, and consequently, they had to endure the very unique fate of being the sons or the son and daughters of the headmaster. So I can't claim to be a totally kindred spirit of yours in that sense, but particularly if you have more than one child, we may share something else, and that is that having the same parents and looking somewhat alike is where the similarities end among our three children. And how many times over the years I have heard the same from parents who say, "Oh my gosh, our kids are all so different." In our household, and you're getting a peek into it here, uh, the situation was we had the classic firstborn, always focused, intense, hard worker, eager to please, never had to be told to do homework or fulfill other responsibilities, straight A's. Then there was the millennial middle child, easygoing, prone to procrastination, quiet, sensitive, a peacekeeper, big on friendships, reluctant to stick to any sort of plan. He once said to us, "I'm really not prepared to sign up for the rest of my life," and much less to make major commitments, I should add. Successful enough academically, but certainly living in the shadow of the older sibling. And then there was the baby who, in our situation, did not speak until she was about 3 years old, and struggled mightily in school as a result of a combination of attention deficit, auditory processing issues, visual problems. She would cry herself to sleep during middle school years, feeling dumb, as she would call it, because of her school performance, and ugly because of the corrective lenses that she had to wear for her visual issues. So if you are trying to match up the descriptions that I just gave with the photos, I can tell you our oldest, that firstborn, is over here on the left with her two very different grandbabies. Her two babies are grandsons. She's still very driven and working hard to balance a full-time architectural career with being the mom of these two little guys. And then there's our son, that middle child, at of all places, at the base camp of Mount Everest about 4 years ago, checking off a bucket list item at the age of 26 before starting his career as a high school counselor. And then there's the baby girl, who with maturation and the right support fully blossomed in college. And she's now in charge of digital marketing for a major firm here in Baltimore. Three very, very unique kids. So as their parents, our awareness of that kind of uniqueness, and in some cases, our suffering through those differences in our children, provide even more cause to look at schools through a very personalized lens. And it's the lens of what you know about your child and what you and they believe will be the best fit for reasons we're about to explore in our time together in this webinar. I wish we had the opportunity for interaction, Q&A, but we will do the best we can. Let's put independent schools per se in some kind of context. First of all, there are 57 million elementary and secondary students in the United States, 51 million in public school, about close to 6 million in private school, of which 79% attend a religiously affiliated school, and in independent schools, about 700,000 students in this country. In terms of schools, there are over 130,000 pre-K through 12 schools in the US. 91,000 of those are public or public assigned schools where the kids don't have the opportunity necessarily to pick what district they're in. There are charter schools, 7,500, private schools, about 33,000, and independent schools, about 2,000, give or take. So independent schools represent just over 1% of all the schools in the US, pre-K-12 schools in the US. That is a very small niche in the pre-K through 12 school world. I think it's useful perhaps to also refresh ourselves on some of the nomenclature and what it means. Private school being a school that is not administered by local, state, or national government. Also referred to sometimes as non-state or non-governmental. Now, an independent school, and sometimes folks will use these interchangeably. Independent school, the bottom line is they are not part of a larger entity. For example, they're not part of a religious diocese, a Catholic diocese, Episcopal diocese, for instance. They are certainly not part of a governmental entity. And they're not part of another instance of a for-profit educational company. They're independent of those larger entities. The lines do get a little bit blurred sometimes with, for example, if you have a Catholic diocese, if you have within that you may have a school that is run by a Catholic order, whether it be the Franciscans or the Xaverians or the Dominicans. It's run by an order. More often than not, they will consider themselves independent, although they are run by an order, which adds another layer of consideration and governance, perhaps. But by and large, they are considered independent unless they are part of unless they are a diocesan school. I was associated for many years with a Catholic school that was independent. However, the particular Catholic diocese owned the school's property. And so there were some, as you could understand, there was some additional dynamic there. So there was some additional dynamic and some strings attached to that arrangement. Okay. But by and large, independent school, not part of a larger entity as we've discussed. Here are the main characteristics of independent schools. They each have a unique mission. They are varied in size and educational approach. They can choose which students to enroll in their school community. They are self-selecting, a major difference between independent schools, private schools, and the public schools, of course. They can determine curriculum and programs for themselves. They are governed by an independent board of trustees. They are supported by tuition and charitable giving. They're accountable to their communities, to their constituencies, and they are accredited by a regional association. So for instance, if we have any folks watching this who are in the state of New York and they're considering independent schools or want to learn a little bit more about independent schools, probably that independent school is gets its accreditation, its evaluation and assessment and approval by the NYSAIS, the New York State Association of Independent Schools. And other states and regions have very, very similar arrangements. Okay, so there are 20 million parents, we said, like you, who are either have or in the process of having considering multiple choices for their kids. What do parents overall tend to regard as very important factors in deciding on an independent school or any school really for that matter? And secondly, how does that list differ, if it does at all, among parents with kids in different kinds of schools? So we're just going to look at a few stats here. Excuse me. First of all, and if you look at the, I guess it's the top line of each criteria, or each factor, I should say, used to choose a school. Overall, the top line is the total, the aggregate of all parents, regardless of what kind of school they're in. So 79% of all the parents who are considering multiple schools considered the quality of teachers, principal, or other staff to be very important, 79%. Other factors that a majority of parents indicated as being very important included safety, down here at 71%, and the curriculum focus or unique academic programs like language immersion, STEM focus, ESL, others. 59% of all parents considered that to be a very important factor in choosing a school. Now, there were higher percentages of students in private, non-religious private schools had parents who said that the following factors were very important. So again, let's take a look at how some of the parents of kids in private, non-religious private schools, let's see what factors they emphasized more than others. And that would be the bottom line under each factor. So look at this. 92% of the parents of kids in private, non-religious schools, 92% said that the quality of teachers, principal, or other school staff was very important. And compare that, for example, to those in public school, 77% by comparison chose that factor as very important. Let's look at, we'll pick that curriculum focus or unique academic programs. Again, this bottom blue line, 74% of those in private non-religious schools saw that as very important in their decision. And you can compare that to 58% of public school parents who thought that curriculum focus or unique programs was very important. That's fairly significant. One other thing I can point out on this chart that's rather interesting. those in this area right here, private religious schools, look at that. The religious schools, 57% of those parents said curriculum focus was very important. Again, compared to 74% of those in private non-religious schools. So I hope this gives you a little flavor. Let's go on with some of this overview. Let's continue with what private non-religious parents value the most. Number of students in class, 58%, right there. 58% of those parents, again, from private non-religious schools, saw number of students in class as very important. Student body characteristics, 42% of the private non-religious school parents. That surpassed all the other groupings of parents, 42%. Conversely, look at this, for cost as a factor. Only 14% of private school parents saw that as a very important factor in making their decision. Whereas for public school parents, 29% said that cost was a very important factor. And that could be simply because, I'm speculating, because those who attend private school, they have the capacity to consider a tuition. So cost doesn't become that much of an issue as it would for somebody else who really would have to think very hard about paying that kind of money for the education. Now, on this chart, I think we can get an idea of what parents whose kids were in public schools assigned more value to. Quickly here, let's look at, oh, sorry, I have to go to the next one. Here we are. Let's look at extracurricular options, including before and after school programs. Okay, it's this orange line. Those are the parents of kids in public school. 31% saw that as very important, a very important factor in making their decision. Compared to, look at that for private school religious, 24%. Not a huge difference, but some gap there. In terms of special facilities like gym, planetarium, library, probably athletic fields, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is the public school parents, 26% saw that as very important. Private school, religious, only 15%. And lastly, the quality or availability of special ed, including services for students with disabilities. Among public school parents, 25% saw that as a very important factor, whereas for private school religious, only 13%, private school non-religious, 17%. Significantly more of a major factor for public school parents. The final chart here, just a few things to point out. The religious orientation of a school as a factor. Well, not terribly surprising, 38% of those in private religiously affiliated schools saw that as a very important factor. Look how that compares to the other categories of parents and schools. You might have thought that would be higher than 38%. I did. But then I was thinking about it, maybe for those parents who have kids in religiously affiliated schools, private schools, it's a given that that's a factor. It's a given that they're going to want that for their kids. And so it could be that they were looking only at religiously affiliated schools. So it wasn't a very important factor, but it was a factor and certainly a bigger one than when compared to the other categories of school parents. Um, the only other thing here we could look at, academic performance of students, very similar results, hardly any difference there in how that ranked as a criterion. And finally, convenience of location of the school. Look at this, 30% of the public school parents saw that as a very important factor in their decision making, whereas for the private schools, non-religious, only 14%. Convenience hardly factored in at all as a major criterion to be considered. So that there's the overview of what matters to the 20 million parents like you out there. That was a study done in 2018 to 19. I would think the numbers have probably held up, although the influence of COVID remains to be seen in data like this. You may have a very similar list of factors in mind. And if that's the case, you're off to a great start. And these are all wonderful criteria to consider. I'm going to suggest, though, that you go deeper. So in this next segment, I'd like to share a few ideas for how to look under the hood, so to speak, of an independent school, or really any school for that matter that you're considering. This relates to the people you should be talking to, the kinds of questions to ask in search of substantive, meaningful information, and it relates to whether or not you're focused on what we're going to call inputs alone, or if you're also inquiring about a school's desired outcomes. So I am encouraging you to take a look under the hood of this educational vehicle that you are exploring. Here are some things I would advise you to do. Attend an open house the school is offering, whether virtual these days or on campus or both. And of course, what will the pandemic allow? That's probably going to vary from school to school, but if at all possible, attend an open house, have your kids participate in a shadow day or whatever is being made available to them to really look under the hood. Talk with current or past parents, alumni, parents of alumni. Ask them these questions. To what extent did the school succeed in fulfilling its mission on behalf of you and your children? To what extent did the school succeed? Would you recommend this school to others? Why? Why not? Spend focused time if you can with faculty, even in casual conversations if you need them, and or the administration. Here's some questions to ask. Why do you choose to serve at the school? What attracted you to work here? What keeps you here? What are you working on currently to make the school even better? What are your hopes for the school for the future? And then if you can, if you or your students, your children can take part in one or more casual conversations with students at the school, ask these questions. What do you like best about your school? What would you change to make it better? Folks, all of their sales pitches, or most of them, to be honest, their literature, their website, the tour guides who've been trained, all of that is geared to highlight their strengths, as it should be. And I know that we asked this question when we were taking our kids to see colleges. when we would get a chance to talk to students at the college. What would you, if you had the magic wand, what would you change to make this college, to make this independent school a better place and to provide a better experience? Because they're not necessarily going to lead with that in their literature and their website and what have you. Fill in the blank. Ask them that. Fill in the blank, please. You will do well here if you are blank. As a student, you will thrive here if you are what? Pardon me. And a final question: do teachers and coaches challenge you to be your best? Do they engage you successfully? Are you challenged? Are you engaged? In preparing for this time with you, I went on the website earlier today and I picked out a typical New England boarding school. It's probably unfair to say a typical school. I picked, let's say, a random boarding school. I went to its website to see what kind of information was listed on the homepage describing the school. And this is what I read. These were the bullet points. Founded in 1780, somewhere around there. 120 different course offerings. It listed as a third bullet the number of states and countries represented in the student population. It mentioned the average class size. It said that 46% of the faculty members held advanced degrees. It mentioned the number of interscholastic sports. And finally, it listed the student-to-teacher ratio. Now, all of those items are inputs. They're all pieces of information that you know going in. They talk about things that are in place at the top of the educational funnel, at the start of a student's journey at a particular school. They represent the kind of data that most schools tend to showcase in their self-descriptions and the answers to questions that parents tend to ask most frequently. The information that those inputs provide may be valuable and useful to you during your search process, but I'd like to point out some deeper considerations related to each input and to suggest some additional questions to shed more light under the hood. So let's look at those inputs. Number one, very frequently asked question. What's the total enrollment? As on that New England boarding school website, how many students are in a typical class and what is the student-teacher ratio? Good questions. Good questions. Important info. But here are a few additional considerations. Smaller size of a school could foster, certainly, collaborative and a tight-knit environment once we get past the pandemic. And smaller size can foster a better level of engagement with parents. Not much question about that. On the other hand, though, it might not be everything because a larger size school might well allow for greater resources, improved facilities, stronger activities, stronger sports programs. And something else to consider as a deeper consideration, if small size of the school is the result of a continuing pattern of decreased enrollment in the last several years, that is a red flag that you might want to explore further. They might tout their small size of school community overall, but if they were at 1,200 kids 3 years ago, and now they're at 600 kids, you need to ask more questions. Okay? And here are some additional questions that I would suggest to go along with the ones up here at the top. Beyond what is the total enrollment and the ratio, ask this: what kind of student represents the best fit, the one who will really thrive here? Here's another food for thought question. You could ask faculty or preferably administration or the admissions officer, whatever. Is it preferable to have, what's the school's philosophy? Is it preferable to have 12 students in a class being taught by an okay teacher? Or would the school prefer to have 22 in a class with a great teacher? If those were the two choices, what's the school's thought on that? A second input and frequently asked question. The word rigorous factors in a lot. Do you offer a rigorous curriculum? And how many AP and honors courses are there? These are inputs, particularly the second part of that. I would recommend that you drill down. The word rigorous, first of all, be careful. That needs to be defined. I've seen schools where busy work is another way to put lots of, we're rigorous is a synonym for busy work, for just piling on the homework and making it a challenge just to get through. What are the prevailing instructional philosophy and methodology? That's a big question. That's a key question. For instance, here are some questions to ask, particularly related to that bullet. Would you say that the school subscribes more to a sage on the stage versus a guide on the side method of teaching? Is lecture predominant? Is it a combination? What lifelong learning skills are being encouraged? Is collaboration emphasized? Is instruction differentiated? That means, is it delivered with the variety of learners in mind, the variety that you have in your classroom, in your school? How is technology integrated and for what desired learning outcomes? What assessment methods are used and when? Is assessment transparent for the students? That is, do they understand what demonstrations of learning will be expected from them? Or is there no ongoing assessment and the only feedback the kids get is at the end of the quarter when they see their grades and they really don't have a clear idea of what all of that really means? Does the school emphasize critical thinking, strong communication, finding solutions, reflection as an integral part of the learning process, and hands-on learning, including connection to the larger world? And finally, ask them, how do you educate the whole child here? Mind, body, and spirit. These questions, friends, will, I think, take you further and deeper than simply asking, is your curriculum rigorous and how many AP courses do you have? Drill down, look under that hood as much as possible. A third input, very frequently asked question, what extracurriculars do you offer? I would rather talk about extracurriculars in terms of co-curriculars. Maybe just a semantic difference, but I've learned enough over the years to see that there are schools where athletics and the arts are almost treated as separate divisions, separate programs within the one school. And that's why I prefer the term co-curricular, because all these programs should work in concert to achieve the same ends. So in that vein, ask questions like this. Does the school provide a variety of niches for students to explore where their involvement will be respected and celebrated? And is there an appropriate level of communication and shared purpose between the academic and the co-curricular programs? Are sports in their own world, or are they viewed by teachers, coaches, administration, everybody as grass classrooms where you're teaching the same kinds of lessons you are in history class, only looking a little bit different? That's what co-curricular means. So I would drill down and get to the heart, the core of this issue. Don't simply stop at what extracurriculars do you offer. Input number 4, good question. Where do your graduates go to college, and what are the school's average SAT or ACT scores? Now, again, these provide good information, and they're actually more related to outcomes than they are inputs, and that's good. Again, I would drill down deeper with questions such as, what's the philosophy of the college counseling program? When does it begin? Are you only successful if a certain percentage of your kids get into the nation or the world's most selective colleges, or do you emphasize finding the right fit for your graduates? Do you track your graduates? Do you track how they're doing in college? It's not an easy assignment, but if a school can do that successfully, they can use the data to then inform changes in the school curriculum and program. This is what our alumni are saying. They could have had a better grounding in technology, or they could have had a stronger conversational approach in their language classes. Do they use that information by tracking what their alums are saying and how they're doing in the colleges? So drill down, again, drill down, get under the hood more. Input number 5. Very often it's asked, what kinds of support services? We saw it on the charts a little bit ago. What kinds of support services do you offer students? How does the school deal with student difference and differences? Ask parents who have had more than one child at the school. Just like we were saying, our kids are also different. You often get a lot of good insight from asking parents who've had more than one kid. How did the school deal with those very differences between your children? And one more input. Obviously, very pertinent, very much on the mind of parents looking at schools. What is the tuition? What are the opportunities for financial or merit scholarships? Now, obviously, again, that's an important item that you need to know. But I would suggest that you ask also more broadly about the school's finances, because tuition is such a key ingredient in the overall picture, obviously. Again, what percent of budgetary expenses is covered by tuition? And I put here, this is sort of a two-edged answer, because on the plus side, the closer that answer gets to 100% of budget being covered almost entirely by tuition, you could look at that as a good thing, because then the school doesn't have to rely so much on outside sources of funding, including its annual campaign, donors, grants, foundational support, what have you. On the other hand, if a school is that reliant, close to 100%, let's say, or even 80, 85, 90, 95% on tuition, if there happens to be a crisis or a downturn in enrollment, you can expect that tuition is going to go up. The chances of it going up to meet that crisis or that downturn, the chances are greater that you're going to be suffering through some pretty hefty tuition increases. I think, therefore, it's also necessary to ask questions about all sources of revenue, because they are interdependent. So ask, does the school have an endowment? how much of an endowment. Also, how much is raised? How much is budgeted to be raised through an annual campaign? And then related to that, what is the percentage of parent participation and giving in the annual campaign? What's the percentage of alumni participation? We could also add to there the board of trustees. What percentage of the board gives to the school? It's also a great indicator of what the commitment is to the school on behalf of those constituencies. Now, I hope that segment equips you with a portfolio of perspectives and new questions to ask that can further elucidate for you and your student if a particular school represents a great fit. Now I'd like to share what I will admit are my 3 favorite questions to ask of a school, its faculty, staff, and/or leadership team. As I've mentioned earlier, inquiry about the inputs is necessary and it's potentially helpful, especially if you drill down beneath the surface, as I've encouraged you to do. However, in my opinion, learning about a school's desired outcomes is even more crucial. Here's an analogy I read that was offered by a Portland, Oregon company in explaining the difference between inputs and outcomes. Quote, measuring inputs and stopping there is like packing for a trip, filling up the tank with gas, and then announcing that we've arrived. Guess what? We still have to take the journey. We've got to go the distance. We've got to get the outcomes that we want. How many sets of clothes and how many suitcases you have for that trip are inputs. They're like the percentage of faculty with advanced degrees or the number of AP courses. Gas in the tank for a big trip is every bit as necessary an input as having the right course offerings to attract students, but it's also an input. It's what's present at the beginning of the funnel, at the top of the funnel, and at the start of the journey. But it tells us very little about where we want to go, for what purpose, and to what end. It tells us 46% of the faculty have advanced degrees. What is that saying about, again, where we want to go, for what purpose, and to what end? So, to see if the school is really road ready, that is, ready to help your child on the journey, kick the tires further. And I would ask you to ask and pay very close attention to the following. Number 1, find out how the school would describe the desired academic and personal qualities of its graduates, what many independent schools now call their graduate profile. And here's the million-dollar question. What, Mr. Head of School, Ms. Admissions Director, what would you like to say about all of your alumni, all the kids who graduate from here, because by virtue of them having been a part of this school and this school community, what would you like to be able to say about all of them? I once asked this question. I was a finalist for a job as an upper school head at a really fine independent school. And we were coming down to the last stage of the interview process. And we were all sitting around there, search committee, and all the top school leadership. And I asked these words. And folks, I got in response a terribly awkward silence, blank stares. And finally, it would seem like hours. It was a few minutes anyway. I think it was the academic dean, kind of stumbling, said, well, we like to think that our kids are good writers. And that was about it. And nobody else chimed in. And I withdrew my candidacy the next morning, and I accepted a position a few days later at the school that did answer this question extremely well and demonstrated how they were authentically moving toward the goals that they had, which referenced the kind of learners, the kind of citizens, the kind of human beings they were helping to nurture. So I think it's a huge question. Um, I wish we could talk and see what you thought, but I would recommend that question to you. Secondly, find out how the school prepares students, not only for the next grade level or for college, but for life beyond academia. Here are the questions to ask. Do you help young people wage a good struggle? Do you foster resilience and what now is often called grit? And do you prepare them for disappointment as well as for success? Schools and we as parents, certainly, we want nothing but the success of our precious ones. But unless they are incredibly fortunate, they're going to have to encounter disappointment, failure, heartache, heartbreak. And I think it's part of the role of a school to prepare them for life that contains all of those elements in it. I wish I'd come up with this quote. I didn't, but an anonymous educator did say this: schools should offer preparation, not just for a life of tests, but also for the tests of life. I think that is a huge factor. How a school addresses that issue is a huge factor, should be in whether or not they're selected. And finally, though private or an independent school, how does the school fulfill a public purpose? How does it teach, and I'm not saying just in this age, but in all ages, how does it teach civility, respect, democracy, informed, responsible citizenship, equity, social justice, a sense of belonging to each other in this beautiful diversity of humanity, and of being a part of larger things: classroom, family, school, community, nation, planet. Ultimately, to me, these are the goals, the outcomes to which an independent school should aspire. Now, you may be thinking that this data or the data used or needed to demonstrate attainment of these outcomes are really hard to come by, and at best, very subjective in comparison to what we can determine about those inputs that we were examining earlier. And I agree with you. I can't dispute that. Schools don't do much in the way of longitudinal studies to see how many of their graduates changed the world. The evidence they provide typically is very anecdotal, which is better than nothing, but it's not highly objective. However, I would suggest that these questions here must still be asked, because they will give you insight into a school that go beyond the more objective data. And if the school can't answer them, I personally would think twice about selecting it for my child. And finally, there are some additional key considerations that if your time in speaking with students at that school, parents, past parents, administrators, faculty, whomever you're speaking with, if time permits further questions, these are pretty important ones as well in your selection process. How the school community feels and how your child feels to be in it. Now, this obviously is not one that you're asking others, but you could have gone through all of the questions and examined all the factors and criteria we've been talking about here. And to be honest, um, sometimes, you put the pros and cons on a piece of paper, and that usually works, but sometimes it's just your son or daughter looks at you and says, that didn't feel right. Uh, yeah, I know it's got X, Y, and Z and all those inputs, and I know what they say about what they desire is for outcomes for their kids, their graduates' future, but um, this is a school. It just feels better for me. I feel I belong here. I fit in here. That's the X factor. Independent School Management, it's a think tank based in Wilmington, Delaware, did what they called a model schools project. It was back in the 90s, and they found through voluminous research two factors that they identified as variables very strongly associated with student performance, satisfaction, and enthusiasm. And those were predictability and support. And I don't have the time to go into these in great detail, but predictability, something as simple as a student knowing that there's a level of consistency. And that if a student, let's say in a more of a disciplinary situation, if a student does X, then Y is going to happen. They know that that's where the school stands. That's just one tiny example of many that they offered, but these were the two factors, predictability and support. And another key area, another key consideration, what's the school's commitment to always getting better, to being better tomorrow than they were today, as applied to the teachers and staff? What percentage of budget is allocated to professional development? That's a great question to ask. How is it distributed? Is it the squeaky wheels, or is there some program for making that professional development funding equitable? And is there faculty and staff buy-in and even better leadership of that program? Or is it something that's imposed, pardon me, where there is not that level of empowerment and buy-in? And last of all, professional accountability. Is there, for example, at the school, a document that states the criteria of professional excellence? I once suggested this to a school that they adopt this. And I asked the question, well, I'll tell you what the answer was first. It was an answer along the lines of, well, we don't really need that. That's kind of understood. And what I wanted to say in reply was, okay, if I was choosing a new doctor, a new medical practice for my family or myself, and I walked into the doctor's office and said, can you share with me your criteria of professional excellence for your practice? And they replied, oh, we don't have that. We don't really need it. Why should schools be any different? And I don't know, I think it's an important consideration. What does a school look for when they're hiring faculty and staff? And what systems are in place to attract, retain, reward, or if necessary, dismiss faculty and staff? And then the last consideration I wanted to mention, parent-school partnership. Find out what you can about the effectiveness of communication. Is it frequent? Is it meaningful? Is it two-way? Are there good listening ears at school? where parents can be appropriately involved and be true partners in the enterprise? Are there opportunities for involvement for parents and expression of concerns and recommendations in appropriate ways? So that pretty much wraps it up. If we were all together, this would be a time where we could do a little Q&A, and we can't do that, and I regret it, but I'm so grateful for your listening to this, your kind attention, your interest. Here's where we are, and we would welcome your questions, your thoughts, your trust, and your involvement with Embrace. However, we can be of service to you and your kids. So, best of luck with your search process. Thank you again ever so much, and again, very best wishes for continued safety and good health and hopefulness always. Take care.